Maybe you have found a bug in a bug bounty program before and they rejected it and said it's not a vulnerability. But then you noticed that they still fixed it. And now you might be mad and think, this must have been a vulnerability because they fixed it. So in this video, I want to talk about the difference between security vulnerability and security risk. I think the line can sometimes be blurry, but it's important to understand, especially when you are into bug bounties. A lot of bug bounty programs only pay for vulnerabilities, so it's important to understand the difference. But also in IT security in general, sometimes people say something is insecure, but they don't mean it in the sense that it's a vulnerability, but in the sense that it's risky. Let's talk about it. A while ago, I already made a video about what is a security vulnerability, where I explored a few different examples. And if you watched that video, you know that it's often not easy to identify if an observed behavior is a vulnerability or not. And I told you that I don't have a good definition or checklist for it either, but I do think I know intuitively when something is a vulnerability. In another recent video about how to secure a Linux server, I went over popular best practices, how to prevent your server from getting hacked, applied to my intuition, and basically concluded they are all useless, but only useless when it comes to real security vulnerabilities. Some of the best practices are maybe not useless at all, but only when it comes to security risks, given a risky environment or context. So let's start with an example from that video, specifically the recommendation to not allow password login for SSH. In the Linux server video, I argued that for security, it doesn't matter if you use SSH keys or SSH password authentication, even though every article about protecting a server from hackers recommends that. But it's important to understand what I mean when I say it doesn't matter for security. What I really mean is, will you get hacked if you don't do that? And in that case, SSH keys or passwords make no real difference. But I also acknowledged in the video that you still have to follow good password policies, meaning you should have a long and unique password. But having password authentication in general is not a vulnerability. It doesn't make you magically hackable. What makes you hackable is a bad password. So I would argue when you have a guessable password, that is the vulnerability. The bad password is, not the fact that your SSH server allows password authentication. Which means when you do use a strong password with SSH password authentication, then there is no vulnerability there. You will not be able to hack into that server, at least from an SSH angle. That's why I say from a security perspective, it makes no sense to address and change this. But I acknowledge that I have a very absolutist opinion. For me, security means if you get hacked or not, because of a vulnerability. But security in the real world is a bit more fuzzy, especially when you start to look from the perspective of security risks. Risk analysis can get complicated and often very subjective. In my server video, I was talking about best practices for your personal rented Linux server. And in that context, I consider the risk introduced from password authentication to be very, very low. But does it apply in all contexts? Well, let me paint a different picture and use this server in a not typical way. Let's say you rent the Linux server and by default you get a root password, you can SSH into it. And then you follow along my new pseudo security research series. But for testing, you want to create a regular unprivileged user. So you type user add, you create a user and give it a simple password user. It's just for local tests and you are root anyway. So what does it matter if this user password is bad? But suddenly you opened up a door for a hacker. Now you have an exposed user with a guessable password. And it's probably just a matter of time that an automated scanner might find this login. SSH user, password user, and they are in. Now you can argue, damn, that's super insecure. If you had disabled password login and just use SSH keys, then this would have not happened. And if you also made SSH listen on a different port, those automated scanners might not even find the guessable user password. And yes, I agree, I am not dumb. Of course this would be the case. But first of all, this is not the typical Linux server use case, but much more important, I would still argue the vulnerability you introduced was creating a guessable user password. That is the root of the issue. And fixing this by changing the password to a very strong one is fixing the vulnerability. And in the end, you made a mistake. You introduced a vulnerability in your server setup by creating that user with a bad password. You can think of it the same way how a programmer might make a coding mistake and introduces a vulnerability in code. We know that the best programmers make mistakes and introduce vulnerabilities. So do the best sysadmins. They make mistakes in their server setups. So if mistakes can introduce vulnerabilities, maybe we want to do certain things to mitigate those risks. And yes, disabling password authentication could mitigate the risk of mistakes like this. But it's extremely important for me to make this difference between risk and actual vulnerability. Oftentimes people mix those two and you think sometimes it's insecure, you feel like you could get hacked, when in fact you could also manage that risk and be aware and never cause the actual issue. Understanding risk is very important. Understanding risk well requires a lot of knowledge of how computers work. And I think my video about securing Linux servers showcases when those best practices are kinda dumb. But when you understand how stuff really works, then you can make your very own educated decision based on your personal risk assessment and decide if you disable password authentication or not. Now, I started this video mentioning bug bounties and then I drifted away talking about Linux servers. Sorry. So let's do a very common bug bounty example. Open redirects. And let me say it right away. I think open redirects are not a vulnerability, but they are a security risk. When looking for open redirect examples, I found this cool blog post by Christian Cornea, Top 25 Open Redirect Bug Bounty Reports. Exactly what I needed. But what is that? Open redirects paying out thousands of dollars and I'm saying they are not a vulnerability? What? Open redirect allows for an account takeover, $8,000. But let's see. An error in our OAuth flow, an attacker could modify the state parameter to have poisoned central.uber.com path. I don't want to explain OAuth flow here, but the actual vulnerability was the fact that you could modify the state parameter, which resulted in a redirect to an attacker-controlled path on central.uber.com, which also included the OAuth access token. And now you combine it with an open redirect on this domain to forward this token to you. So the vulnerability here was in the OAuth implementation, specifically how the state parameter was handled. And the open redirect issue was only an additional puzzle piece to make the whole attack work. Next report is just a comment on an RFC, not really a bug bounty. Then we have here 3K open redirect, but it's actually a XSS, not an open redirect. Next one, also an XSS, XSS. Stealing local files and JavaScript injection, XSS, XSS. As you can see, not really open redirect issues, they are XSS issues. But as soon as we drop lower, we start to get reports that are purely open redirects. And a typical payout seems to be $500, but also plenty of $0. So you can see, XSS and account takeovers are pretty clear vulnerabilities as they really allow you to really hack an account. And the root cause for open redirects sometimes can be used to trigger an XSS as well. For example, when it's implemented with a window.location redirect. When you set it to a JavaScript URI, you have a XSS. But there are many ways how the open redirect could be implemented. And so many times XSS is not possible. So why should a bug bounty program reward a pure open redirect report? You could argue that it's risky because if you have some kind of OAuth flow issue, an open redirect could be combined to steal the access token. But first of all, the web app in question must even use OAuth, and if it's not vulnerable right now, it's unlikely that it will change so drastically that it suddenly is vulnerable. Server-side request for the release where the URL is validated to have a certain hostname could also be bypassed with an open redirect, but again, the actual vulnerability is the SSRF that allowed to connect to an untrusted host. And the last argument, and the weakest, but often used, an open redirect could be used for phishing because the URL looks trustworthy. But that is so weak because in HTML emails you can also fake links all the time, and in general we want to train users to look at the domain in the browser to determine if a site is safe, and the redirect will redirect to a bad domain anyway. So as you can see, there is sometimes a little bit of a risk having an open redirect. But this risk is dependent on the context, dependent on the actual functionality of the app. So on one side you have a domain with OAuth and webhook functionality. Maybe it's more risky and maybe could be fixed there. But then you also have the complete other side, like a link shortener, where the open redirect is by design the app's functionality. But either way, I hope you agree that open redirect in itself is not a vulnerability, but it might be a security risk because it could make other bugs actually exploitable. So for a bug bounty program, such a report is difficult to handle. On one hand, they might think we don't really care about it, it's not an actual vulnerability, but then they might still put it in their issue tracker and eventually fix it, because often fixes for that are super short. And now we come into this awkward place where it's not a vulnerability, but it also got fixed. So should the program pay for it? I don't care, I'm luckily not into bug bounties, but I can totally understand why the payout would be zero for just an open redirect. So to summarize, for me, a vulnerability is really something that breaks a security boundary. It's an access control issue where the user can do something that only an admin can do, or a XSS where you can perform actions on behalf of another user, or SQL injections where you can dump the database. And the cool thing about vulnerabilities, most of the time it's easy to prove. You can write an exploit or describe reproduction steps and give you access to something you should not have access to. And so in the contrast to that, there are also these risky things. They are not as clear, like open redirect, SSH password authentication, compiling binaries without ASLR, or even writing something in an insecure language in the first place. They do not result in your system getting hacked, that's why I don't call them security vulnerabilities, but they might increase the likelihood of mistakes that could lead to actual vulnerabilities. And of course, as security-conscious people, we want to minimize risk as well. We have a vested interest in that, but at the same time, security risks are often talked about as if they are vulnerabilities. People can get really heated in debates about them, but in the end, they are just risks, and risks depend on the context and environment. So for one person, a certain risk minimization best practice can make sense. For others, they don't make sense. And not to mention that certain risk mitigations could even introduce new risk somewhere else. So if you follow certain best practices, but others don't preach about it. Maybe you just don't understand their unique risk context. Anyway, I hope that you keep thinking about security risk and security vulnerabilities in the context of IT security. And when you have findings, I hope you can classify them properly. Try to be clear about if something is just risky or actually breaking something.